Okay, guys. Hey, I'm going to do a real quick voiceover for you guys on this particular Origins of the Renaissance PowerPoint. You can take notes on it however you need to. Obviously, you can go back, scroll through this thing, take a look at it, and take notes that you need to. I'm going to try and go through this in about 5 minutes. So obviously, it'll take a little longer than that for you guys to take notes, but I wanted to give you a little bit of narration to go along with it. So here we go. All right. So the origins of the Renaissance. What are we talking about when we talk about the Renaissance? We're talking about this period of great creativity in the arts in particular is one of the places where you can see it. But ultimately, this is an explosion of creativity across the European continent, not only in the arts, but also in society in general, in the government, in religion, in science. And so it's going to lead to basically the beginnings of our modern world, right? So why did it happen is the question. Well, there's some people that would argue that it didn't actually happen, that it was a moment in time, right? There is no moment where the Renaissance begins. You can't look at a date where it starts, but this period of history absolutely happened. And what happened was something strange that's kind of difficult to define. You have this swerve, this kind of course correction, this movement away from one way of thinking to another way of thinking. It's just kind of a difficult thing to really kind of put into words. But ultimately, what it comes down to is people started to think more about themselves individually, thinking about improving themselves, educating themselves, making their life on Earth a little bit better in the here and now, as opposed to always focusing like the medieval world had on just what happens after you die. Like everything before that had been about what happens when you die. You got to make sure that you're ready to go to get to heaven. And so every moment of your waking life is based on that. During this time, people are going to still be very concerned about what happens to themselves after they die. They're still going to be very religious, but they're not going to be as religious. They're going to turn to a little bit more of a secular world, more of a, hey, religion's important, but it's not the most important thing that's happening in our lives. We need to also focus on making what we're doing here and now worthwhile as well. So recognizing that while religion was important, it didn't need to be the first thing that they thought about every morning and the last thing before they go to bed at night. It was about, hey, we're human beings, we're part of a system, we're part of the world, and we want to make sure that that experience while we're on the planet is actually worthwhile. So that's kind of why it happens. And what is the reason for that? There's a lot of reasons. We're going to talk about those really quickly. Okay, so just to kind of point out, by the way, I have some pictures here that kind of show like what art looked like during the Middle Ages. The one over here on the left, this one is something from like the late 700s. Then you have Giotto over here on the right. He's basically from like the late 1200s. Down here you have what is a really traditional piece of medieval art. It's an altar piece showing some Christian religion. And it's very flat, but it's a really traditional piece that doesn't really show a lot that we would see in some of the Renaissance art work that you'll see. Whereas this one right here, this Primavera by Botticelli, is kind of an early, it's a late 1300s piece, early 1400s. That kind of shows the difference in art, right? And so that's one really obvious way that you can see the differences between the earlier parts where it wasn't as creative and the later parts where it was. So what causes this? Well, there's a lot of changes in society. Things like the Black Death, once that happens, you're just never going to recover from it quite the same. Everybody's going to think differently. We're currently going through, obviously, a pandemic, which is why we're doing this online. And when something like that happens, it really changes your view, right? Things like the 100 Years' War, where people were fighting for so long with one another. And then the development of actual nations. We always kind of take for granted that nations always existed. They didn't. But you start to get these strong monarchies that are going to establish little places that are like, hey, we speak the same language, we have the same customs, we worship in the same way, we eat the same foods. Those are all things that start to really make for a developing of actual strong and independent nation states, which was actually kind of a modern thing. It's not something that always existed. You also have the end of institutions like these traditional feudal systems where peasants listen to their landlords. Like those things are going to start to break down as a result of things like the Black Death, where peasants became more powerful, at least in small ways. They started to demand more rights. And also, they had little innovations that kind of made war, the way that they had fought war in the past, a little bit obsolete. So things like the longbow are going to make a difference as well, because knights could no longer enforce the ideas of feudalism. You also have, as I mentioned, the development of nations. Places in particular like France and England were some of the earlier nations to organize into a unified people under a strong monarchy. And so when you have that individual government, that unified government, that makes a difference too. Trade is going to increase. You have people bringing ideas back and forth from east to west. They get new innovations, new ideas, new ways of thinking. And one of the more important people that did that was our buddy Marco Polo. New ways of thinking, when you get those new ideas and those new innovations, people are going to start to obviously think differently. And they're going to find some of the old stuff,